So it is my pleasure to be here today. We planned very carefully, and I'm quite excited to be part of this discussion. And I think one point that we're going to discuss as well in my presentation is how this capital planned environment has been related to this metropolitan and the struggle for the contemporary urban condition. So I will start problematizing what is landscape. Landscape normally is seen as natural field, natural landscape as a passive setting. And landscape start to be represented, first of all, for paintings and all kind of representation that was really into a kind of scenario. And here, I'm going to struggle for another meaning of landscape as territory, as Sola Morales says here, that this notion of territory is a notion to understand as well things physically, like topography and the history and the facts that happen in it, but also this social appropriation, how things deal with this temporality in this action and the conflict that goes on the territory. So landscape, the first etymology comes from Latin, pagus, which designate territory where one dwells. And this dwelling means much more from inhabitation in itself, but how we dwell in the world. So we're struggling here to see landscape not just an invisu, like something that's static, that's part of scenario, but like how it's situated in the everyday life, in the everyday practices of it. So we're gonna see this planned environment, not just images and drawings and things like that, but how it came to the fore when it's situated in the fully experienced of it. So in this presentation, I separated in two main parts, like landscape in situ, how this tectonic really makes part of the role of thinking about landscape and of course Brasília, and together with it, like struggling with it, there is a kind of landscape ex situ, that struggle for this recognition, and that's how the conflict goes on when you have design, construction, and habitation. So landscape in situ really does a lot of to do with topography. This was the only drawing that before the contest for Brasília in 1957, all the architects who participated in the contest received. And if you can notice, this line, this was the drawing that we found in the archive of Lucio Costa. The only line that he drew this, it was the monumental axis. There was a really deep study of how the topography was going on, not just because the architect, but how, all the elements they gave for the participants. Because one thing that was really well known before the Brasília was built, it was a site. How was the topography? How was the water supply? We have mineral studies since from the 19th century about the region, and they chose this part after several expeditions. And also there is the Belcher report that really described the land very, very well. And that's why they knew exactly where was going to be the lake and how it's going to be and how deep it's going to be. So one thing that's very interesting, we can see more or less where the city plan was built in the topography around it, about the Paranoá lake that's going to be constructed. And one fact that's quite intriguing is that even the palace, the Alvorada Palace, it started to be built even before the contest, the urban design even be chosen, because they already start the construction by the lake, constructing the Dale and everything, the airport and the palace. So it was already almost like the whole structure was already done when they decided how is going to be the urban design. And what I found very interesting in this Costa's drawing is how he struggled trying to understand the topography and how it's related to the urban design and how this planned landscape is going to be built. And you can say that a lot of drawings about how to manipulate the soil. There is there has been written a lot about, of course, the greatness of Niemeyer's design and everything, but I really want to put attention how the construction of the landscape by manipulating the topography was going to the fore in the design of Brasília. And we can say here, for instance, this line here, it's not natural in the site. Or it's quite the opposite. They have to move with a lot of earthworks here to design and to have, for instance, the day of the bus central platform here to be built and to have this connection to the south side, to the north side. So there are a lot of struggle in the tectonics of it, how to make it appear so natural and so flat as people imagine to be, but it's not so flat at all. Imagine if you see this here, all these lines here, it's about 10 to 20 meters from the lake of highness, so it's not so flat as we imagine, but because it was thought about with the topography, we start to have to think how this openness can have this inhabitation at the same time to be a capital, but also to be a city in the sense of this ideal city, how to dwell on it. And of course, also the interior spaces was always think together. So there's insociability between architecture, urban landscape, and the construction of the territory. So this is the first construction itself is a quite known picture of Brasília, the road access and the monumental access when they just started. And we cannot imagine how much this will structure to the region itself, as we're going to see later on. So I'm going to make an argument about this tessitura, this Latin word that's the fabric, but how the part and the whole, they are making each other to understand what kind of design strategy we still can put on the floor to discuss the urban condition today. I'm making an argument to see if Brasília is still Brasília as a planned environment, not Brasília itself, but all these several capitals that was built, what we can learn of them about urban design and if it still responds to the contemporary urban condition. So as you can see, the biggest, maybe perhaps the biggest construction in Brazil is not really the building in itself, in themselves, but how this site was manipulated to construct the landscape and the articulation for dwelling in it. So those are some of the archives and the constructions of it. And to go to the second part of my presentation and how in this tectonic dimension, we have this more social practice and more, how can I say, ex situ in the sense of how it's been appropriated and being struggled with all of this. So that's why I bring here this painting of Nicolas stage that for Normandy in France. And he starts to take the elements, some abstractness about how the sky and the pavé, the bricks, and all the this typology, we can imagine the landscape. And I think some elements, such abstractness that we have in some planet environment, always bring to the fore another kind of appropriation that's not really related to the traditional sites, as sometimes we see a lot of criticism about the planned environments that they are not really historical, so people are not attached to them because they don't have a strong identity, a historical identity on it. But on the other hand, this migration that came to Brasília, all the workers and work on the fields, there was such a huge impact in the Brazilia's culture. Just to have a picture of it, this is the dimension of South America. Brazil is right here in the Cerrado and the part of this region. And this was part of the political thing to make this integration, because all the capitals in Brazil were like facing the Atlantic Ocean, almost all of them. So it was really important to change the vector of development in Brazil, particularly because the South is already being industrialized and the hinterland is not really occupied, not in the sense that there were not people there, not at all, because there were a lot of several streets and new towns going on. You're gonna see tomorrow, Ricardo Trevisan will talk about just in the Republican time, that's the end of 19th century. There are more than 200 new towns built in Brazil at that time. So there was a kind of connection and looking at the winterland to build this thing of it. So it's not at all something that just started in the middle of 50s, but it's a history in the struggle and the political agenda since the 19th century. And this mobility between the pilot plan and of course the satellite towns that were around it, that they were just built practically at the same time, reconfigured many other narratives or a plot of this urban tissue, and how people really struggle in this planet environment and add things and made another kind of relationships that were not at all planned, but at the same time it were made part of it. And these dislocations between the whole traffic, the whole thing about the mobility and all things that happen in Brazil, it really came, here's the pilot plan, and we have this whole region here, and we have some layers going on because most of them are planned environment with the same principles, the same modernist principles that we had in the pilot plan of Costas, but in fact, how they react on time and the gesture and the political conditions were quite different. But they were not at all Islams or some kind of radical how can I say, segregation that was in the beginning. Nowadays, for instance, Brasilia, we have one of the biggest human index of quality of life in Latin America, most of them because of infrastructure and the water supply that we have in the whole system. So there are some intriguing things that's very interesting to look at it today. So we are looking at this tessitura, this tissue, as how these collective places, landscapes, as territories, they are mixing together and they are overlapping this kind of appropriation. So instead of looking at Brasilia as this magnificent postcards and how great, like we have the symbol of capital that's really fixed in everyone's memory when we are getting into those buildings. In this research, that's not just only mine, but with colleagues, and then there are some who are here, like Carolina and Guilherme, and also Cauê. We start to see Brasília as a kind of laboratory, and how this planned condition that's open, that there is kind of modernist void, but it's also non-compact. There's nothing to do with the paradigm of the compact city, can be resilient or not to the urban conditions today. What lessons can we learn from it? So we start to look at this kind of ordinary landscape that was built, and how it touches the soil, and how it gives, for instance, the entrance of service, and we have the pedestrian path above, and how can he deal with galleries and these pathways. And I would like to take you some to walk on Brasília. It's not just Brasília's cars that we used to see, like in the biggest freeways of it. Of course, there is that, but there is also this capillarity that we go into the system that's quite intriguing. For instance, here's the Galeria dos Estados, that here passes the road access, and here we have all kinds of things going on, and the connection. This picture was during the pandemic, so we cannot really see the people passing by here, but normally it's quite a busy place, because here's the bank sector, and above you have the commercial sector, and you have all these paintings and everything. And this was the picture when it was already constructed in the 70s or even the 60s of this area. And Brasília, over time, particularly with the vegetation and how the density of the satellite towns that go back and forth, the pilot plant, as well other centralities that are growing during this almost 60 decades, we have another feeling. So we try to represent in another way. So looking at the space of it, not just picture of this postcard, but to see how really functions and how really works with the mobility. For instance, here is the road access, but underneath we have this gallery and the metro station and this commercial center that connects the other side of it to the bank sector. And here we have that viaduct, and the picture that this pillar here is just this one, just to understand a little bit. And we just recently, we published this book that we are trying to drawing out this design strategies. For instance, here's the cathedral, the lake, because the lake is also on a planned artifact. So we are trying to look into as a kind of research, not to be a kind of monographic study of Brasília, but what kind of conditions can respond to the outskirts of Brasília in itself. For instance, here is the EPTG, the highway parkway of Taguatinga. Here's the Sol Nascente, that's the one of the poorest region in Brasília. And here we can see from the North Lake, one of the ongoing growing part of Brasília, one of the most recent works of Niemeyer, the tower here. So we can see that landscape is being transformed and being appropriated as any other Latin American city, if you can see. But so this urban condition that deals with this generic architecture and generic kind of landscape that we can almost we can figure out as every peripheral area, deals with this infrastructure, these highways, and this what Álvaro Domingues really well explained yesterday, that really struggles with the sense of time and space, because we can go really faster than normally than a compact city. But at the same time, you overlap some layers, and sometimes the substructure just transform some parts of the city as fragments and divides the territory. And this territory becomes a kind of fragments and voidness that has been so much criticized from urban planning as a wasteless, as a residue or something that should be more dense and should be more connect. But of course, we do agree that we need this density that's connective in the certain places, but in these metropolitan areas, the non-compact is a fact, and how to deal with it. And we have a hypothesis that dealing with the landscape, the topography, and the first structure, we can find or can maybe perhaps have some design tools to design the parts of the city that just don't have this perfect condition to build everything at once and to be everything planned as an ideal or utopic dimension of it. But instead of that, we're dealing with three strategies here. Earthy works, becoming, and gardening. What do we understand of it? The earthworks is how this manipulation of the territory that, of course, in Brasília was huge, but we have this manipulation everywhere when you pass a highway in a metropolitan area. Maybe instead of just being an infrastructure artifact, maybe will be a chance to connection, to put services, to connect one part of the other, like we have in the gallery that I just showed. But we need this technology. In the 60s was reinforced concrete, but we have to see how technology will struggle that to give this sense of openness and this sense that sometimes is just a viaduct, but sometimes it's a place huge of people, huge of life. So how to deal with the matter of scale? Scale is a huge matter to understand. Now, because sometimes we think that this kind of landscape is already there, but not at all. It was a lot of work to design it and to give this kind of complexity. This is the sector of entertainment center that's just right here, that just start with these galleries. And he became a kind of everything happened just in the center of Brasília with some layers and garages and shops and places, and we have all kinds of recreations right in the center of Brasília that completely different what it was planned, originally planned, but in the same time it became quite fidel to what, in terms of morphology, what was supposed to be. In the beaconing, we have maybe the best example is the TV tower, also designed by Costa. Costa just designed two architects in Brasília, the TV tower and the bus station. And here we think that he just put the tower on the top of the hill. But in fact, there was no hill. The hill was fabricated, like we can see here, on the top of it, and did this drawing that we did, just to make this beckoning, this strategy to have this perspective, and also to hide and to put the whole program underneath that we have here, a TV setting and radios and all kind of services, and you cannot just see them all when you have this. And at the same time, we have this huge reinforcing structure that makes a kind of belvedere to the whole city and give one of the greatest view of Brasília. And this geometry that can seem so rigid, it's what we call the gardening, because instead of Le Corbusier used to say that's the free circulation for the pedestrian, and it's a kind of a homogeneous size and topography of it. Instead of it, there are a lot of textures, grass, and where the stairs and the parking lot. It's quite complex design of the soil, and this is what we call gardening, in the sense of how to compose those open spaces, or this modernist void, and how it's been appropriated, in the sense that the church is not anymore a church that you go inside, but it's a church that you stay outside to see the mass, and that depends on the weather and how the sun goes by. And you have this kind of what Guilherme used to say, that's not three-dimensional space, but it's a 2D dimension and a half, because you still have several designs on the floor, very tiny if you think about the scale of the site, but it's very important to deal and to negotiate to everyday life. And here we were trying with the students to rebuild and redesign, to see how complex is something that seems so simple and so open and so homogeneous, as people used to say. So how to deal with this kind of genetic that just reproduce and kind of don't give sometimes reference to the landscape, or this infrastructure that's just divide sites instead of connection, and give you opportunity to struggle with several scales of it. So we are using Brasília as a kind of laboratory to understand how the non-compact, how the dispersion, or all the other kinds of landscapes that they are not historic or compact can be designed or thinking in the urban planning. So Brasília today, there is another kind of appropriations, like people are being naturalized with this openness and this kind of postcard that's part of it, but it's also part of their everyday life, and this how people think and how significant the public scape, even the parties and the, you know, on the underway passages and things like that. So I finish here with this quote of Paul Ricoeur, saying that the constructed space is a kind of mixture between places of life surrounded by living body and the three-dimensional geometric place in which all points are any places, like the present, which is the node of narrative time. The site is the node of the space that we create, that we build. And we sometimes, surprisingly, we have this kind of appropriations in this natural site. And I finish here with this picture of Marcel Gardereau in the beginnings of the 60s. That's it. Thank you very much.